Wonderful. It looks like we're live. You're here with Mr. Chris Pyke, Chief Innovation Officer of GRESB, long and storied career prior to that, and a good friend to many of us, not just me, out there in the community of real estate and sustainability, as well as myself, Matt Ellis, founder and CEO over at Measurabl. Today, after we get a little bit of admin out of the way, we're going to take you into, I hope, a thoroughly enjoyable, provocative, serious, but also very helpful conversation around the state of play in green building and in particular certifications, and whether or not that regime is actually helping and serving us in our environmental and social goals. To start, let's make sure you know how this is going to be conducted. We're going to go for about 45 minutes, and depending on Q&A and content, we might run this as long as an hour. I hope if you're watching at lunchtime, you've got some popcorn and get to enjoy yourself, but that's the time. In terms of the follow through, you will be able to see this as a recording and share it with the community and your friends and colleagues. So that'll be posted shortly after this presentation concludes. It is interactive, so there is a chat. Go ahead and please submit questions as we go, suggestions. Chris and I are fully aware that we have a point of view and some experience, but that the wisdom in this conversation is absolutely in this call. I think there's several hundred folks that registered, and we're delighted to have you participate in this with us, not just listen. All right, so that is the key couple pieces, Q&A and recording will be available. Otherwise, you are muted, so you can't jump in and just scream and shout. It does have to go through the Q&A. What I'd love to do to get us started then is turn it to you, Chris, if you don't mind, just a minute or two on your background, and then go ahead and just flow right into your opening thoughts on this article of ours that we're here to debate. Actually, let me hold you because I should introduce the article that precipitated this call. So for the audience in the preamble to this call, this was put together coming off of a Bisnow publication with the title of this: "The Green Building Certification System is worth billions, but it isn't helping cut carbon." And the authors, Mr. Mike Phillips and Mark Faithful, went into a fairly provocative point by point on how the regime of green building certifications that you all know and maybe don't necessarily love, labels, scores, rating systems, are not actually synonymous with outcomes in real estate. That's a debate that Chris and I have been hearing for a long time. It's time to get after it, right? So that's why we're here, to really unpack whether or not this regime is helpful to the real estate community, advancing our causes of more profitable and sustainable buildings. Chris, now with that in mind, go ahead and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Matt, thank you. Thanks to you, your team, for organizing this. I appreciate the chance. So for those of you who I might not know, my name is Chris Pyke. I'm an environmental scientist by training. I've worked in sustainability in the built environment since getting a PhD in 2002. Just a little bit, my background, I have been in federal agencies with US EPA. I spent over a decade working with the US Green Building Council, and now this is my second time around working for GRESB as Chief Innovation Officer. I also teach urban and regional planning for Georgetown on the side. My premise going into this conversation, and I'm looking forward to talking about the article, the issues it brings up, is that green building is a powerful theory of change. It has made a positive difference in the world, and it can evolve to meet those challenges going forward. The thing that I think is really important, just to kind of frame the conversation a little bit, is that green building is not synonymous with an outcome like a plaque or even a certification. Green building is a theory of change. Green building is a market-driven way of driving positive outcomes in the built environment. And the way that I understand green building is that it is rooted in the idea that across the real estate industry, there exists a range of practices and performance. Stakeholders can come together to define the characteristics of superior sustainable real estate. And by applying those definitions in tools like rating systems, we can create market advantages for better real estate and a virtuous cycle. That is not a stationary process. So the last thing I'll say in this opening is that this theory of change has proven radically effective over 25 years about increasing awareness about sustainable buildings and delivering sustainable buildings in the real world. That said, we have to evolve that concept to address new and emerging issues, to make sure that we are keeping up with what we need from sustainable buildings going forward and to take advantage of new technology along the way. So you're going to find me be an advocate for the power of green building as a theory of change and putting the right context around this tool and making improvements as we go forward. So Matt, with that, I'm looking forward to how you're framing your thoughts, and we're going to dive into a bunch of subjects.
Right on, Chris. Thank you. By way of background, I'm a real estate professional. As I started my career at CBRE working in leasing and corporate real estate. So I did not come like Chris from an academic background. I have not worked in the certification side of the business, at least directly. What I've done is leases and real estate transactions. And so I come at this question of certification, ratings and labels, ROI and all the rest, really from that perspective, which is, are they in service to the business of real estate or not? And I do want to, just for fun, those of you who have seen Part of the Interruption PTI, you know that whether you like it or not, you got to take a side of the debate. I'm here to take the side of the debate that the answer is no. Actually, these labels and certifications no longer serve the best interests of real estate investment, occupiers, lenders, insurers, and so on. I think there was a period of time that they did. And where I come from on that is that they helped create a common lexicon of how we should define green, how we should think about the differences in buildings and their performance. But what's happened now is we've ended up using that term too long. There is actually no such thing, Chris, in my view, as a green or not green building. I think that's one of the critical fails in the system, which is that they tend to encourage us to think that way. All buildings are on some spectrum, okay, from really quite abysmal, polluters, consumers of raw materials and all the rest, unhealthful, etc., to gleaming assets. I think what's important is that we look at the actual KPIs and performance to show us where they are on that spectrum. I don't believe in the hard distinctions of green and not green. Again, that's not to say that this wasn't a regime that built or came from a place of helping us think about, define, standardize, and so forth. I just think we're at an inflection point, really need to evolve the conversation and drive those KPIs back into how we do the real estate business. Okay, so with that, Chris and I have tried to take as much as we can some differing points of view here, and we've organized our conversation at least around these major three buckets. We'll see how far we get past that. The first one is this notion of plaques versus performance, which you could tell I'm kind of leaning into the performance side. And Chris, we want to hear your thoughts on the merits of the plaques. The second thing we're going to get into is just the sheer diversity. I think Chris was talking a minute ago about when you look around the world, and certainly even from GRESB, and this article makes the point, dozens and dozens of different labels and certifications are acknowledged to be meritorious or worthwhile. I think that that's actually highly problematic. So we want to talk about the diversity of these regimes and see if that continues to make sense. The third major topic is the ROI of it. Is this the right use of our time and resources to get that label, to get that plaque, to submit that fund and so forth, and get the score? So those are the big three. Chris, let's get after the first one, the performance versus plaques. Do you actually look at it that way? Do you think do you think plaques actually can be synonymous with performance? Do you think they're
Yeah, I'll launch it in the spirit of
opposition?
being at the spirit. We've had this conversation a number of times, and I'll just kind of go right to the bottom line. I think the argument you make on this one is a false choice. Performance has always been central to green building. The difference is that stakeholders differ in how they define it and have different ideas about how they pursue it. It's never been a lack of appreciation for performance as the thing. The issue is, and it continues to be, there are many ways to understand performance across the life cycle of a real estate asset. We have performance during design. We often call it beating code. We have a version of we have a performance path to beat code. And in that case, it involves beating a baseline requirement, often with respect to something like operational energy. We have for decades had the notion, every major rating system has had a notion of beating a benchmark. So for LEED, for decades, it was Energy Star, or a decade, it was Energy Star, beating the CBEX code, which beating CBEX, by extension, Energy Star, with respect to normalization by floor area, vacancy utilization. And the thing that made that as part of a plaque, as part of a certification, was we established the rules to translate that performance into recognition. A certain period of time, a certain set of rules, a certain set of how good that was. And I also think it's a bit false that there is a dichotomy about green, not green, at least from my perspective. We understand that rating tools out there, they exist themselves in a spectrum. Sometimes, like Energy Star, we've got a way of understanding 0 to 100, a continuous notion of energy efficiency. We've always had gradations of what it meant to be green, except in a narrow set of conditions where it was an absolutist, yes or no, I'm passive house or I'm not, something like that. But that was the exception, not the rule. So the thing that I'll come back to about this performance versus plaques, that is not to basically throw out the entire your point. I do embrace one of your points is that we need performance needs to be more prominent, or the market would like performance to be more prominent, and we need to be more explicit and transparent when we get a certification. And let me turn this around for a second. When a certification is provided that includes performance, which is the normal thing, we need to be explicit and transparent about the timing, extent, expectations under which that is done. I think the issue is not an underlying focus on performance. It's an underlying lack of transparency that reveals that. And I'll say just two more things. That desire to allow people to unpack the certification, to show what that time-bound specific performance requirement was, is equal to a need to have cross-cutting performance indicators that many or all high-quality rating systems share, and linked to the ability for users to add and customize their own performance components. So at the end of the day, I strongly believe that we are not living in a false dichotomy of plaques versus performance. The question is how performance is used as part of that theory of change. That one milestone is a plaque. Lots to unpack there, Matt. Don't want to go on too long, but I'm looking forward to your
Well,
thoughts.
look, where I struggle with this, Chris, is I remember walking down the street in Manhattan once upon a time, and I stopped in front of a building owned by a major public REIT, and it had that plaque on the door. And that plaque signaled that this building was green, relatively good. And that plaque was from 2009, and I passed that building in 2015. And that's where I struggle, is that the actual way that these things work in market does not do what you're suggesting they do. They are a way of signaling to people who are not terribly sophisticated always, prospective occupiers, brokers, or property managers, whomever, that this building is different and better than the average bear. And we all know the famous article that New York Times put up around about that time, which was of LEED buildings underperforming, right, their peer set. So again, you get these issues.
Matt, can I ask you for a quick, when you walk by that building, didn't you do exactly the right thing? You took the plaque and you discounted it over time to your expression of value. So you did the right thing, right? So you think that, but you think that's too much for others to do it that way. Like, in other words, like you had a personal discount rate on the value of that plaque out to the time you walked by.
Yeah.
Probably one I would have shared. Exactly right. So that's the one mechanism that actually worked.
But doesn't that tell you that there's a problem? That the second that I see that thing, I'm already discounting its accuracy or legitimacy? I mean,
absolutely. But that's not a reason to throw out the idea. It's a reason to update that concept. The issue is it was accurate in that it said, hey, at this moment in time, which actually was before that date, right? The thing we have to fix is bringing that into a more real-time mode. But keep going. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt.
But it's good. I mean, I hope the audience is with us as we kind of like, I want to be very, very practical. Like, I want to recognize that the people that are on this call probably spend a huge amount of their time in the day-to-day practice of real estate and probably even sustainability. We're sophisticated enough to make those distinctions, right? When you go ahead and you put labels on them, they actually need to convey to people that are not sophisticated, that are not doing this day-to-day, the value of that. So when we put a label on our food, my daughter has a gluten allergy, it darn well better mean what it says. In the case of quote green building, I think there's a huge gap there, which is that they don't always. And so if you're not, if this regime is really only to serve the sophisticated and the converted, then we've got a major problem. The piece on performance also, by the way, I want to hit on. All of these groups that we talk about are methodologies for defining green. I don't think that they've kept lockstep with what the real estate business thinks of. So let me give you some examples. GRESB, since you're representing that organization today, Chris, we get to use them. You know how big that methodology is. There are so many ways to score points, emphasis on score points there. Very few of them, a small subset, are what I usually think of operational performance. This is the classic performance indicators component of GRESB. And there are these many other things that are about, do you do these practices, whether or not they're measurable performance results. So can you talk about that piece? Because that's where I struggle a lot with
Yeah,
the.
absolutely. And this is where I just think we come to different conclusions about this, of saying, I believe that the ability to understand the status and future of an asset or a company is the product of its capacity, its intention, its direction, and its performance. And the stuff that tells us about the future is the product of all of that. We need to have suitable patterns of governance. We need to have expertise. We need to have targets. We need to have situational awareness, risk management. We need to have direction. And that needs to be manifest in performance over time. But it is insufficient. The way that I like to think about this is performance without intention, direction, and capacity is luck. I don't want to know if you're lucky. I don't want to know that you inherited that performance. I want to know something about your capacity and how it's managed. And then, and actually, I think this is reflected in GRESB today. Almost no one delivers high operational performance without superior management, the infrastructure that I said. In other words, there are not a lot of dots in the lower right-hand corner of GRESB. There's no dots in the lower right-hand corner of GRESB. So I think, and not everything that matters is measured in operation. There is a subset of things that matter in operation. There are other things that are capacities, direction, skills that are foundational. And the last thing I'll say is that the thing that we think of as measured performance is yesterday's news, is what happened yesterday. Really relevant, but of limited utility going forward. Every single day we go forward, the balance between my intention, my direction, and the value of measured performance goes down. And this is said as someone who spent 4.5 years doing the #1 performance-based thing that we tried to do in the USGBC thing. And so we share that. So we'll come back around to this. So
Well,
Matt, that's where
I'm,
I go.
and we'll put a coat on it and maybe start to move off this one a little bit, but I'm not a big fan of aspirations and intentions. I think they're great, and I think they're platitudes, and I think management can say them all day long till they're blue in the face. What I want to see is the actual outcome of those intentions, measured as specific results at a point in time, discreetly and transparently. And I think that's the gap. So I do not think that intentions should be rewarded. You can document them all you like, right? Writing a plan is just fantastic. And I do think, by the way, that those things are leading indicators. If I see actual outcomes and then I get to draw my line, Chris, which way is it curving and bending, right? That's what I want to see. And it is indicative of where I can expect this asset, this fund, this entity to go over time. If I don't have performance
think
measures,
you're driving through the rearview mirror. What I want to do is, like, I will take a low performing fund managed by Ben Myers any day of the week over a high performing fund managed by someone who just came out of a low performing fund, as an example.
So
I want to know capability, direction, vision on top of that performance.
Fantastic. So Ben Myers himself is going to qualify you for a GRESB star?
No, it's both. I want both. I want management. I want capability, direction, vision, and I'm not saying it's not an either or. That's the false bargain here. It's both.
And hopefully Ben is watching and he just.
I hope so too, because he's a good example.
No.
I want Ben to go work from a market transformation perspective. I want to put Ben into the worst performing fund in the lower left of the GRESB universe and watch it bolt out to the top. That's what I want.
I would always agree with that. There was a question, by the way, kind of over here talking about the standards, and it's, what's in that measure, what's of performance, and that definition of sustainability. And I think it's it's poignant one. We talked about it just for a second, which is you have, again, use GRESB, but then look at certifications also. You have fairly narrowly tailored certifications that are specific to, say, health and well-being, like well or fit well. You have more operational performance certifications. Energy Star in the US is a great example of that. And then you have broader measures of sustainability that are both about practice and in performance outcomes. Think of GRESB right here. And those standards, those definitions are, well, they're built by experts and typically with the input and feedback of market. And then Chris, since you've been in this position for a long time, can you talk for a second about, are we measuring the right thing? And are
I
we
think it's
evolving those measures
incredibly
correctly?
useful, actually. And I'll speak to GRESB for a second, but I'll go to the other one too. Are we measuring the right thing? I want to two different questions. I want to empower you to measure the stuff that you think is relevant. But I also want to have a consensus definition that reflects a specific set of values. In the case of GRESB, that's why we set up the GRESB Foundation. The GRESB Foundation, GRESB is biased toward the LP, and it is biased to say this group of people who are selected by their peers to be willing to give their time to come up with a practical central definition for the industry have said, we buy into that default. We buy into that standard. But that shouldn't take away anybody's ability to use those components to meet their own needs. LEED does that differently. They do that to say, hey, we have technical committees, and those folks are elected from the membership of USGBC to create that standard. It is nothing more or less than a reflection of those constituencies. But I actually believe in a both and. And if you talk to BRE, they do it a different way with a more technocratic approach, and the Australians just get it right somehow the first time. I don't understand. But the other thing to think about in this is, I believe there is a value in these increasingly transparent processes to develop the standard. And I believe in everybody's right to make their own separate decision. The thing is, if you make your own separate decision, you lose a lot of the benefits of comparability and benchmarking that come with it. So there are trade-offs to both sides of the equation. But I think that when it comes to GRESB, the thing I'll speak to most, that is why we put together a foundation. That's why we publish a roadmap. That's why we publish the standard. If people believe that, and it reflects the views of a constituency. And if you don't share those views, you can use the pieces of it in ways you see fit. And I think it's a both, yet again, a both and.
Let's take this one because it gets us into the next kind of block of work here, Chris, which is the diversity dilemma, as we sort of framed it, right? There are many standards, and they are all over the map and what they consider material, the degree to which they're material, so aka the number of points that I might assign for a certain action or outcome. That strikes me as really odd. And when we were preparing for this, how is it possible that there can be this many opinions and points of view on what is quote unquote green, if there is such a thing, A, and B, how then is anyone supposed to make sense of that?
Yeah, this is, I think it's a great question. And let me answer it in two different, let me give my opinion in two ways. And this is where maybe I took something different from the article than others. When I'll make a distinction between high quality, holistic, technically founded, mature rating systems, and to your point, a cavalcade of somewhat less of things that don't embody those characteristics. And so to me, the diversity is a strength when it reflects many different people around the world converging on the theory of change behind green building. They believe that they can come together as a community, define sustainable buildings, provide a frame to understand it. And the reality is, what it means to be a sustainable building is, in many cases, different in Berlin, Santiago, Hong Kong, Sydney, or Singapore. They cannot and they should not converge on some common definition. They are very different. However, the thing that I agree with you 100% is that this diversity, it does not need to be synonymous with confusion. And I think the GRESB governance process has clearly said, we have reached a point where the diversity of these things is creating confusion. What do they mean? Why do they mean that? So that's one of the areas where GRESB is going to step in this year. Just like we stepped in last year and we said that we think that certifications expire, just like your experience on the sidewalk in New York. We agree. When it comes to this diversity, the way we're going to solve this is we are going to say, we are going to take the LP's lens and we're going to say, for the LPs in our community, What do they believe? How can we help them understand what certifications mean, what time period they apply to, how to interpret them, and ultimately create more differentiation in that diversity? So, to bottom line, I think fundamentally diversity is a testament to convergent evolution in a theory of change. The problem is that when diversity becomes confusion, and that is not a good thing. And we can fix it by providing more clear criteria and demanding that high quality rating systems provide the necessary transparency to help stakeholders interpret what they've got. If they can't do it, they're not high quality rating systems. And we should just kind of wash our hands of them. That's one first cut at that question.
It's a good, and you know, I'm not gonna, I can't take it, Chris. I can't take it. So this is a major place of struggle for me, is at every level that diversity has become counterproductive. Here's what I mean. As an operator, I am now sitting here looking at the multitude of ways that I have to attest to or demonstrate my performance, not all of which are, they're not complementary. In fact, they can be in opposition with, say, the way that I should account for carbon and report that for regime X versus the law of the nation that I'm this building sits in. And maybe those don't always dovetail. And that's a huge problem right off the bat. So part one is I am faced with too many ways to report and measure my performance. On the other side of that, as a off-taker of that information, say I'm an investor, lender, insurer, some arm's distance from the real estate asset or the portfolio, I can't make any decisions here. Which one am I supposed to go with? Which one is the most credible? Which one is the one that has the right balance of scoring and prioritization? And so I think that at every level of this, the diversity to me is really become a ball and chain on the industry weighing us down. What we need to be looking for is what are the essential measures of performance that cut across. And here's also where I don't agree. I do not think that, I get it, there are data centers, I get it, there are office buildings, I get it, there are mixed use buildings and all the rest. But for goodness gracious, these are fixed assets pinned to the ground. They're not moving around. They've got utilities on them, that we can understand these things. They're inherently measurable, right? There's no reason that we can't come to a consensus on a common set of statistics that define these buildings' performance in a way that everybody can transact against. Is it, and if we go the opposite direction, Chris, if we actually say there are all these special snowflakes, it depends on not just what type it is, but where it is, then how are we to make any progress?
I agree with you that we can come up and we should come up with, and we are very close to coming up with a core set of common. I don't think we should exaggerate how far apart we are on common metrics. We all agree: energy, emissions, water, waste, some degree of occupant experience. I think that there is an emerging consensus around a core. That said, I do think that buildings very often are snowflakes, and they need to be contextualized. And it's okay that there are different values. When you go to Chile and you are in the most seismically active place on Earth, it matters how you deal with seismic, and that it doesn't matter in Washington, D.C., that it does matter in Tokyo, and high humidity in Atlanta is different than the Nordics. Okay, we can't wish them away in the interest of comparability. And ultimately, but the key thing here is we need transparency. And yes, there are we probably have too many in an absolute sense right now. One of the other things you said, though, that isn't about certification. I do think we're making a mess, actually an intentional mess, with the proliferation of local standards and benchmarks and so forth, like New York City. Living in a world where expectations for good vary between Manhattan and Hoboken is not a scalable, great world. Living in a world where single issue preferences, like, hey, I need to reduce carbon and I don't care what the consequence is for indoor air quality or worker and labor rights. That's not green building. And I don't accept that that's even part of something I want to be part of, actually. So that kind of leads down this road. If you go further down that road, do I think, to take your point, that the kind of recursive splitting of standards, like splitting health and well-being from green building, I think ultimately was a tragedy. It was a tragedy that green building let happen. But these are, so there is a degree of convergence and re-evolution that we can have. We have folks out there who want to to use that diversity to create a bit of chaos. And I think that some of the folks, you know who you are, if that's your intention. And on the other hand, I do think that there is clarity about the high quality holistic rating systems. And in GRESB world, there are 5, 6, 7 rating systems that accommodate 80 to 90% of the activity. So even though there are a ton that are recognized, the vast majority of practice, the market is picking, and the market and we can help them navigate that.
Let me give you a hard time on that. But if you're saying this, that there are 5 or 6 or 7 of these high quality ones, which is still to me a struggle, and I'll explain why after this comment, then why do you guys recognize so many?
It's a fair question, and that's one of the things we will come back from as a GRESB hat on. The real estate steering committee has said apply more rigorous criteria to this.
Right.
Partially, the reason we recognize a lot today is that this has grown up around us. We established and we do differentiate them, right? We got a 0, partial, minus, partial, plus, and full. We understand that there is a difference, but this has grown up around us, and now this is the year where we're going to raise the bar on those, and we started doing that this year. Like causing them to expire in a certain way is the first act we've taken to raise the bar.
All right. Well, I wanted to keep you guys going far enough. And here's what I'd like to close out on the diversity dilemma as we're framing it is, Chris, I often think of, so real estate's a financial asset class. And when we think about financials and financial reporting, I really look at things like GAAP accounting. It's a way to make sure we don't have the WeWork phenomena happening. Remember WeWork, everybody. Community adjusted EBITDA. It was the way that WeWork wanted to communicate its financial performance. And the investment community laughed. And they said, you can't invent your own way around describing how healthy, or in their case, not you are. There is a commonly accepted way of communicating financial performance. And why don't we do that with sustainability metrics? And we don't have to respond because we'll move on. But I really do think it's a great way to see why I worry so much about everybody being able to go around and have, no joke, bordering 200 viable sustainability standards and certifications around the world. And I just can't fathom how that allows us to consistently communicate and again, transact on a core set of well-documented and consistently communicated metrics. It just doesn't work, in my opinion. It gets us to this other side of the way of looking at it. It's a really practical one, the ROI of it all. So let's imagine that certifications, I saw a question about, well, don't certified buildings outperform in terms of asset value, rental rate per square foot? And there absolutely is great literature from Pete Eichholz, our friend Nils Koch, and Norm Miller at USD, and a number of others that have drawn those types of conclusions. JLL's done good work here. CBRE certainly has as well. I think what happened was we actually noticed that underneath the hood, it wasn't the certification itself, it was actual performance attributes for those buildings. We should look at that and say, is it then worth it to pay for these certifications? Is that actually the right use of capital and time? Remember, getting a certification done isn't just a cost. It's actually an effort of the certification itself. It's actually the cost of arranging those people, coordinating them, following the methodology, whatever additional overhead goes along with it. Should we put the money there, Chris? Or should we put it in the next HVAC intervention or the next green bond issuance? What should we do?
All right. My take is this is I'll just say one last thing on the last question. I do think there's going to be, I think there's more agreement than it seems. We agree that there should be fewer and more transparent and higher quality certifications out there in the world. I think that's going to be where the curve goes. Whether the curve goes to 1 in an IFRS land like you described, I'm an EFRAG guy in that way myself, and so we'll agree to disagree on that one. When it comes to this ROI issue, I think that the issue of this is a false dichotomy. Green building is a theory of change. It is not about the outcome of a plaque is one outcome, but the issue about green building is how you drive positive change. That action of green building, if you need certification to enable the internal decision-making of your project. To, in other words, to allow sustainability to win, to save water, to improve energy efficiency, to fight value engineering in the project, then that process is worth the money. And if you need to distinguish yourself, and you need to provide an anchor so that you can, so that when we do those studies, we can find what is green and what isn't green. I actually think it's very difficult to understand how we would have done those things without a certification paradigm. And the bottom line is that I've been involved in all sorts of cost of green type things over the last decade. They are all complicated. They're all situational, running from the National Academy of Science to the Defense Department to zillions of individual projects navigating these things. The bottom line is twofold. One, the cost of green building is a function of the baseline. What is your default expectation to bring a building to market? What's optional? What's additional? Commissioning, not commissioning, data gathering, venting indoor air contaminants, managing recyclables, all those different things. If they are additional to you, then they're a part of the cost. If they're part of your process, they're not additional. And the reality is each project some projects can use that help in sorting that out. There is also a cost to verify claims. Real estate is a trust but verify business. We verify our income, we verify our insurance, we verify our property condition, and we should verify our sustainability, and that shouldn't be free. It should cost less over time, and we can talk about how we do that, but it is not a free thing because sustainability matters, and we should be clear about whose definition we're following, our own or otherwise, and that does incur a cost. It is a modest, negligible cost against the entire development process. The last thing I'll say about this is we understand that just like any other business process, the cost of green building is a function of skill and experience. We see lots of teams out there who deliver LEED Platinum, zero net energy at market rate, and they document it incredibly well. Look at the NREL Research Support Facility. Perfect example of an exceptionally large, high-performance commercial-style building delivered at market rates in a well-documented process. We know that they can be delivered to cost less to operate. We know that they can be delivered to have higher exit values. The bottom line here is I don't think if we come to the conclusion that this whole process of generating change is not needed, then you better be clear that you're replacing it with something equally effective. And right now, I think it's easy to take shots at this one way without offering a robust, scalable, proven alternative.
We go there next. Remember, you and I are good to go there next. What's
Yep.
the
So just
future?
I'll jump off that soapbox right now, Matt, and say I think the issue is there is a real value to the process, and the cost of it is subject to great imagination a lot of the time.
Remember the article that we kind of get us going here, and their claim that this is it's a system worth billions of dollars, and whose billions are those? Now, that's actually not true. They got that wrong. It's not the case that USGBC, GRESB, or otherwise are minting hundreds of millions of dollars in private revenue. But these things aren't free. And you said earlier, like, these are negligible costs. I just have to disagree. I think in a world where landlords are giving back their buildings, I think in a world where interest rates are high, and I think in a world where digitalization, the real estate industry is imperative, and they have to find ways to improve margins in the property management. Ask anyone in property management how great those margins are. Every penny really counts. And I'm not so sure that we need to be handing any of those pennies over for things past. I agree with you. Limited assurance and validation of data. Absolutely. We do that in our financial reporting. We should absolutely do it in our sustainability claims. I like that part. And I think we should drive that cost as close to zero as we possibly can. But the premium on top of that, it's not immaterial. And it's also, by the way, that cost is the one that you can see. The cost underneath it for the sustainability professionals and service providers and data management systems and so on is absolutely material. So I think that it's easy to look at a building and it's worth $100 million and say that's a negligible component.
Matt, what is in and out in that concept? I know we have to move on, but like just help me go in and out on this thing.
Paying for the plaque, paying for the label.
Is it $10,000 for a plaque, or is it the expertise that went into the plaque? Is it the commissioning? Is it the data collection? Where do you draw the line? Like, where is that line?
What I just described. I think you should pay to validate the data. I think there's some really good ways to drive that cost to very, very little. I think you should perform the work to make the better building. I think you should look at any number of systems. Before any of us ever came around with our various certification methodologies for green, we had ASHRAE, and energy optimization was absolutely a thing. It's been a thing in real estate since the 70s. So I think those systems and those methods
It
all
was the
exist.
failure of that regime that led to green building. So okay, it's the failure of that regime. It is the failures of the 70s and that regime, the throwing out all the other things that mattered in pursuit of energy efficiency, among other reasons, that we did this. It was the confusion about definitions that led to the modern green building movement. It was the ability to get rid of things like tobacco smoke and asbestos and some of these were some of the things that inspired us. So we're at risk of we're going to go in circles here if we don't. But I yeah, these are the good. This is the good conversation.
I agree with you that like, and part of this discussion is what's material and what advances like the asset class and the needs of the people that invest or occupy those buildings. Like that's continuing to be a debate, and that's where the market should compete. I'm just pointing out that there's too many ways to distinguish that, and there's a cost to that piece, right? And that cost, I don't think, is worth it.
And we agree that cost should go lower. I think that we have a bit of disagreement is I think there's some things that are material, and there's also a whole pile of externalities that we also should care about that need to get brought in. And so it is the stuff that is IFRS style material, and it's the impact of that building on people in society that also matter. And so not everything has this sort of crispy, clear ROI, because it is the things that our buildings do to society and the environment that also have value that green building brings back on the equation. People may or may not like that.
Chris, we got to be careful. We can't make every aspect of society and environment, force all of that into and stuff all that into a certification and expect the building owner to solve for all of it in perfect balance. Like I muddled my way through early econ. I got the econometric variable or the econometric equation. There's so many variables until the point where I lost the plot, right? We got to remember this has to be doable, solvable, practical, repeatable, scalable. So here's another way to see how flawed that is. How many buildings out of the entire building stock are certified to any standard at all? What percentage of that marketplace? What, 1-2% of the global building stock? So we're already at a risk of saying that if certification is necessary for progress, we've already failed. We already know we have irrelevant penetration of these standards. And if they're this common, we make them even more complicated and insist that they solve for so many more variables. Take that to the mass market. It's not going to happen. And we don't have a theory of change.
This is where I don't agree with the framing about it. And I think you could also look broader. If you look back to the times we have good data, for instance, LEED is recognized in there is a piece of LEED in 75% of commercial new construction requirements.
But new buildings aren't the problem. Well, it's existing building stock.
We just have to go where the data is a little bit. That is somewhere I can go and say, hey, this is the thing. We collectively have trained hundreds of thousands of people in a shared vocabulary of sustainability. Those are part of the theory of change. The plaque and the number of buildings that get a plaque, that's not really the issue. The issue is about how this theory of change works and are we driving change? Do I agree with you 100% that green buildings maybe biggest failure of the last 2 decades has been its fixation on the top quarter of the market and its inability to find legitimate transformation pathways for the other 3 quarters. We agree on that 100%. And that is going to be the make or break issue for green building going forward. That's a good conversation.
Yeah, so let's keep it simple. Let's keep it simple. Let's not make it one ring to rule them all. Let's agree that there are consistent aspects of real estate. And I can tell you that's true, Chris, because there are brokers and property managers around the world that don't get bogged down the way as sustainability professionals are. They can still transact, they can still compare their buildings, and they can still recommend good, better, and best assets to their customer base or as a lender, which ones they want to lend to and not. Why aren't we able to do that as consistently and sustainably? I think it betrays the problem that we've got here. As we wrap up, guys, so 12:45 for me in Mountain Time, we wanted to have some fun and flip this whole thing around and say, if we were to design the future, of green building, would we design? I encourage you guys all to ask yourselves this question right now. Is this what you would come up with if there was nothing today? Would you have that many standards? Would you have the fees? Would you have the complexity? Would you have something else? And if you had something else, what would that be? So Chris asked this question. He's like, what's your alternative? And I think that's a really good one. So Chris, is this a system you would have? If not, how would it be different?
This is a great place for us to go. Well, let's see how this time goes on this. So when I think about the future of certification, and this is something, and actually it's not the future of certification, it's the future of market transformation, of voluntary, industry-led. I have faith that we can take a 25+ year history and bring it and address its and meet the needs of a changing market. I believe we are going to continue to need practical, community-based definitions of leadership in sustainable design and operations. We're going to continue to need overt third-party accountability in different ways. And we're going to need a way to share knowledge and communicate about practices. These, to me, are the foundations of green building today. That next generation, doing that better in the next generation, is going to require the one thing we agree on is a strong set of core performance definitions, in my mind, linked to even more flexibility than we have today. The way that we operationalize more flexibility is with more transparency. We must be able, through digital platforms, to understand what certifications mean, what ratings mean, what performance data means. We need to be able to access that immediately while you walk down the street and share it with others. And we need to make sure that our definitions of sustainability meet the test of representing superior assets in the real world. Matt, I'll just say one more thing. I just want to, in the risk of, I'll let you have the floor back for the closing as well as saying, I just want to share our resonance around performance. I have, as you know, I've been a competitive runner since I was 14. I deeply value real world performance. And in the beginning, that was simple. Better times equaled better performance. But I also, over my life, have learned the limits of performance and how performance changes over time. My measured performance in my 20s has very little to say about my capacities in my 40s. My measured performance tells us where I was yesterday. And in running, that is the product of days, weeks, years leading up to that moment, those circumstances. My measured performance tells us something about tomorrow, but very little about next month, next year. We need to blend measurements with predictive information, my goals, my focus, my logbook, my age, my workload, my childcare, holidays, weather. And the bottom line is that performance matters, but it's not enough to predict my performance or predict the performance of a building or a community. I think the future of this, to go to your bottom line, and then I'll wrap up, I believe that a balanced, integrated approach to understanding intentions, circumstances, and measured performance is the best way to drive positive change. And it is the thing we need to build and socialize.
Chris, you are such a good sport and such a big thinker. And we work hard for everyone in the audience sometimes for Chris and I to take opposing views and drill each other on it. And I hope represent to some degree the audience's positions and interests and thoughts on this all, and have not been able to communicate or seriously keep up with all the questions. But we committed to you guys to reading them and getting back on our thoughts on them. But here's what I can say, just in the interest of taking an opposing view. I know I'm also used to be at least an athlete, and spent a lot of time training and a lot of time with the coach and thinking about the playbook and all the plans and preparatory work for the game. And then at the end of that game, there was a score. And you won or you lost. And it was objective. And then guess what happened? As you piled on those games and you looked at that scoreboard game after game, a trend became very obvious. This team was either good or it wasn't. That game was played, it's a competitive game, right, against somebody else. And so this is a relative statement about our ability to succeed. And I think that's somewhat way that I look at the world, Chris, which is I just can't get excited and invested in all the intentionality. I can't make it complicated and give points for whether we wrote up enough plays or we trained hard enough in the previous practice. I'm going to look at the scoreboard. And I'm going to see what that team has done in competition day after day after day. And I'm going to make my decisions on what the quality of that team from that. So I think we need to keep this simple. I think we need to minimize the noise. I think we need to find a common agreement on the core and most material set of metrics, and we need to measure those things. I think it's absolutely the prerogative of any private actor to go and expand that perimeter, to add variables, to pursue different strategies. That's called business. But I think what we've done here is we've overcomplicated it. We've added too many layers of complexity and expense, and it's time to get simple. Here's another reason I think that. Everyone that's on this call, and I know GRESB feels this way, LEED, BREEAM, and so on and so forth, we all share the same sense of urgency. We don't have time to solve all the world's problems through the built environment. We need to move on a small set of things and push very, very hard right there. And it needs to be something that's scalable and possible for every building, not just the most sophisticated institutional owners, because there are not enough Ben Myers in the world. Okay, so in closing, what we should do, Chris, is let's use our next 9 minutes or so to just try to riff on some of the questions that are over there. Are you able to read the Q&A? And thank you.
Yeah, gratefully, I can. There are like it is coming through so fast that I might need Christy to digest a little bit. There, it's. I'm very grateful that it is a very crowded Q&A.
And again, there's some that I recognize the names of people on this list, and there's all these people can run laps around the two of us. Well, except for Chris, he is pretty fast. So they all deserve their chance to communicate, and we'll create a forum for that. But one of them, I think, Chris, that stuck out to me was this piece on regulation. We didn't get enough time there on regulation versus, again, we're talking about certifications. By and large, these are voluntary regimes. You don't have to do them, right? They're optional. There are some exceptions, I think, of EU EPCs. Is that what it should look like more? Is government mandated? If we're going to have labels, they're government labels, like food labels. What do you think about that regulation?
My personal take, and this is a good one to end to be at this point, because we can kind of kick back. This is where we need a beer. I'm a markets person. I believe in providing markets with transparency, and I don't think government is needed. I don't think there are certain things that government does well, and I honestly don't think that market transformation is one of them. There's a role for the government in creating minimum levels of transparency, minimum levels of consistency. I get that. But I think in this space, the risk of the government basically setting a floor that becomes a ceiling, slowing progress, creating confusion because of things like local government limitations, or the EU, where it is going to be very difficult to maintain these things in the face of actual experience. So I'm a skeptic about I do believe these are industry problems. I think that industry can solve them. I will grant that there is a place for government, and I think I can look to our Australians for government done right in the case of something like neighbors. So you can tell by my tone of voice. I believe these are largely private sector problems that can have private sector solutions created by transparency and information. Yeah. Maybe we need to have government there, but I don't think government should be in the front seat. It should be raising the floor, and a lot to unpack with that. I don't know exactly where you stand, Matt.
Well, it's a tough one. I think I'm just trying to be realistic about this, that government, right? Think of sovereign wealth funds, like the investment arms of government, and they're trying to make sure that they deploy the people's capital aligned with the people's goals, and those include now environmental goals, right? So I think of a Norgis, or someone like that, government's goals are relevant here, and we have to listen to them. And this also includes not just government as investors, but government as occupiers. I mean, the single largest occupiers in the United States are the DoD and GSA. So when the country has an ambition around carbon reduction, it's natural to see them kind of leaning in and saying, well, we're going to regulate that. That's the people's goal. That's society's goal. And so I think that that's going to show up as regulation. And that's in fact what's happened, right? Look at EU, look at now even the US with California or SEC looming around the corner. It's getting regulated. So I happen to think that it's inevitability, Chris, that what's going on here is regulation will overwhelm certification, voluntary, or industry by industry for industry. We'll have to recognize that we're too big an asset class, that people, the government, have expectations of us in a broader national project. And so I think we should create the space for regulation and potentially the opportunity for that regulation to dictate that minimum. I'm with you there of what the performance should be. And then leave the room for innovation on top of that. But I definitely like the idea, and I'm good with the idea of government coming in, just like building codes and saying, for absence of all doubt, this is the minimum hurdle in terms of sustainability performance. I just think it's inevitability too, by the way. Okay. One more question, and maybe this is going to wrap us up. They're looking at it's kind of back to the ROI question, Chris, and there are studies, I mentioned a few, and look at Maastricht University, Pete Eichholz, Nils Koch, Norm Miller, a number of others, that those are just the publications I'm familiar with, private sector publications, and they are drawing a correlation between asset value, lease up, lease rate, and quote, the CERT. They've typically looked at LEED and Energy Star for the domestic American ones, studies that I've looked at. Can you unpack that for a second? At least you have a PhD, even though it's in geography. Is that correlation or is it causation?
Oh, well, okay. There's a in the 90-second version. What I think we can take from those things, and Nils and others have done studies to show whether it's a labeling effect or not. The thing that we can be grateful for is these markets are more transparent with these labels. We would not have broad scale information to do any of that. So whether it's correlation or causation, it clearly evolves over time. If you look at studies that were done, for instance, for INREV last year, we see combinations of the performance component in GRESB being more predictive. We see studies of European REITs like EPRA by Franz Furst and others who find overall correlations that are positive with total returns. We find correlations between LEED buildings and particularly exit value, Energy Star, and some measures of operating cost. The bottom line is, at least for me as someone who led research on that for a long time, the labels and the data that goes with them are what make the market more transparent and allow us to know any of that. And we should be grateful. And that also comes with an obligation that the owners of those rating systems should continue to make that transparent, should continue to foster that kind of work. And the ones who don't do it, I don't think you're really part of the market transformation deal. So I think, in other words, if you're a rating system and you're not getting that information out there, you're not contributing to that, that's actually problematic. And it's one of those differentiating factors. So Matt, I would love to be able to come to a conclusion and say it's the label versus the thing. In the real practical world we live in, it's the labels, LEED, Energy Star, BREEAM, DGMB, so forth, are why we know any of that stuff, and why those econometric researchers have been able to prove that and give us that ammunition. But that is not an end. That's an ongoing process that needs to be cultivated and continued.
Sure.
And actually, last thing, we'll have an announcement on how we are supporting more of that later this month, or later in February.
Okay, we did it right on the timing. Thank you to everyone that was here. You will get a follow-up survey on how we did today. It's popping up even now. And we appreciate you filling out and give us your feedback. A dialogue that will continue. But you know my point of view on this, hopefully, and you certainly know Chris's, which is that I think for us to reconcile us, we both agree something should change here. What direction it should go remains up for further debate. You guys are the best. Thank you so much, Chris. Have a great week out there.
Thank you, Matt and team. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
So